I like Hiyoko. In my DR character tier list, she's pretty high up. From DR2, top is Hajime, then Akane, then Kamaida, then Hiyoko, probably next to Chiaki. She's a unique case because a lot of my fondness of the character is kind of theoretical. I'm not saying that I subscribe to pure fanfiction interpretations, but my awareness of the fact that Hiyoko was originally meant to be a survivor of DR2 did the, little inception thought bug planted on fucking layer 3 of my brain space. I had a vivid image in my head of a version of this story where Fuyuhiko eats shit in Chapter 3, Hiyoko sticks around, becomes fully integrated into the survivors group dynamic by around Chapters 5 and 6, where everyone is sort of on the same page. The great thing about Hiyoko is that I feel she does this role more compellingly than Fuyuhiko. You can see where it makes sense. Fuyuhiko is, like that mean guy you can see becoming softer and more apologetic, turning around as the game goes on at first, but he's kind of uninteresting in this role because he doesn't even really have prominent characteristics or flaws that make him difficult to work with long-term or make it hard for him to better himself. After Chapter 2, Fuyuhiko has zero trouble being a nice guy to everyone, because he didn't really have problems in the first place. He was just choosing to act like an asshole. The image of Hiyoko that does that same thing, but really has to work on herself and her impulses to be confrontational, bitter, have a bad attitude, etc., and eventually grows into someone the group can value and who values the group, but without going, super overboard, making her a Mary Sue good guy in the way that I feel Fuyuhiko is after Chapter 2. It's an appealing theoretical, and it's clear to see the details the game suggests that was always the original plan. Fuyuhiko feels relatively underdeveloped by the end, and Hiyoko seemed like there was more unfinished angles to take her character in. Plus, it makes more logical sense in Chapter 3 for Fuyuhiko to be the victim, as his transformation into a good guy is very fast, very abrupt, and seems obvious to me that the idea was, in Chapter 3, for him to start rapidly changing for the better, trying to redeem himself, making all these amends and etc. and promises to the future, only to be cut short in the process, presenting the tragedy of his inability to finish making amends, the tragedy of someone who was saved by sacrifice still dying anyways, and, the reality that a redemption arc does not make you immune to death, like it usually is in media. The idea was, of course, that both Fuyuhiko and Hiyoko in Chapter 3 are both people who just lost someone close to them in the previous chapter and are trying to kind of better themselves. One of them dies and isn't able to finish that process or make things right. It seems pretty obvious Fuyuhiko was set up in the short term to have emotional weight for this chapter for his death, while Hiyoko was being set up for a much longer process over the course of the rest of the story. They also, obviously, have other similarities of characters. They're both tied to violent families that shaped their upbringing. They both act tough out of a kind of learned habit to survive in their difficult environments and their family dynamics. They're both pretty matter-of-fact and will call people out on their shit or say things that others are too timid to, etc. Even Hiyoko's tendency to cry and ask people for things to make her feel better is clearly learned behavior from her upbringing. Hajime confirms that multiple times, that she's not deliberately manipulating people in a lot of these acts. She's been raised to be bratty and entitled and hostile. But that brings me to the main point I wanted to make with this video: attitude. See, I tend to like a lot of bratty characters, just whiny, bitchy, bad attitude, angry characters. I also can't relate to the massive hatred that these sorts of characters get for their behavior. In my mind, there is a pretty massive difference between being, evil and being like a mini poo-poo head, What's the worst thing? The worst thing Hiyoko has done to victimize someone? Say, maybe some of her insults to Mikan, too consistent or taken too far? Okay, well, half of the cast in this game are murderers, not even including their background. There's a line from Hajime, I forget exactly where, but Hajime talks to Hiyoko, and Hiyoko, responds by insulting him, and Hajime thinks to himself something like, "Man, I don't even really feel offended. If she has such a bad attitude, she would say this petty stuff to anyone. I can't even take it personally." It's kind of like I mentioned in my Tenko video about her emotional honesty, where none of Tenko's insults ever feel hurtful or dig too deep to anyone because they're really delusional, they're petty, and they're just so openly, obviously about Tenko's desire to say something mean rather than the person's character being under attack, per se. It's not an insult that feels hurtful because it's just that person expressing their own emotional volatility. It's so obviously just meant to be a petty strike that it can't cut anywhere beneath the surface. I just can't see what there is to strongly hate. This is a series where people will go out of their way to defend and try to devil's advocate for characters like fucking Oma, who was directly responsible for multiple people's deaths and traumatizing people and everything, and yet people can't give the benefit of the doubt to the character who's just kind of childishly rude. Really? Take Chapter 2, for instance. Chapter is called Sin and Punishment, Sea and Coconuts, and yeah, the theme of the overall chapter is about crime and punishment. The chapter opens up with a group discussion about Teru, who was executed the night before, and whether or not they should mourn his passing because he was a piece of shit and a murderer. And he tried to get everyone else killed so he could escape. You know, Hiyoko instigates this conversation about crime and punishment. She asks, was executing Teru for his crime an appropriate punishment? Eye for an eye, he deserved it, whatever. The course of the motivation and story of Chapter 2 is about revenge, eye for an eye, or perceptions on crime and punishment. What's an appropriate punishment? Hiyoko avenging his sister, Mahiru's friend that was killed also for revenge, and her thoughts on that situation. See, Fuyuhiko is acting out of personal vengeance, but his opinion is the same as Hiyoko's on crime and punishment. People who commit murder should pay with their life, Hiyoko and Mahiru are unknowingly in an ideological conflict here, as Mahiru, as the character in Chapter 2, is primarily pushing against capital punishment, and that people cannot judge other people for their crimes. We see Hiyoko conflicted and uncertain by the end of the chapter, considering her friend's way of looking at crime and punishment and whether or not it's more reasonable. Eye for an eye mentality, like she had viewed in seeing Teru's execution as appropriate given his level of evil and crime that he committed. Eye for an eye led to this entire situation of back and forth killings for no real reason. This pointless moral hypocrisy in Chapter 2, just making everything worse for everyone who was remaining. Killing Fuyuhiko's sister, Sato, Mahiru, and Peko, all from one instigation, all from one start point. Hiyoko starts to consider the flaws in her views on crime and punishment. But, I need to emphasize this, Hiyoko was always anti-murder. Hiyoko may be, rude and unpleasant and bratty, but in terms of moral values that actually matter and actually, hurt people, are serious issues, she has much firmer resolve than most of the cast. She is very clear from the beginning, murder is wrong, zero justification, people should not make excuses for killers. Hiyoko cares about crime and punishment. She detests crime. She is not a bad person. She has clear, unshakable values. As for her unpleasant attitude and brattiness, well, it's interesting, See, even if you were to argue that someone just being mean and rude is seriously wrong, seriously morally wrong, because it can cause mental harm to people like Mikan who are susceptible, I don't really see most of Hiyoko's rudeness as a lack of moral fiber in that foundation. The thing about bad attitudes is that you have a bad attitude. It's not... Okay, it's like the same with Audrey and Honey Pop. These people don't necessarily choose to be angry and bitter. Their bad attitudes are as much a plague on themselves as it is on the people around them. They outwardly express bad attitudes because they are not doing well. A lot of bad attitudes stem from serious issues, like chronic depression in the case of Audrey, where she's just internally angry at herself and everything, and she's bitter and quick to lash out and think poorly of everything she sees. I don't see bad attitudes in the same way that I see conscious choices to be cruel or do bad things or anything like that. I feel bad for brats. I get it. I get just like being an angry person and lashing out in ways that are not good for you, not good for anyone, yourself included, you know? So much of Hiyoko's malice and desire to insult and hurt people on a whim, her reaction to just think negatively, think poorly of others, think judgmentally, her sense of entitlement and brattiness, it's internal weaknesses she's adopted, not by choice, but by failures of her upbringing. See Hiyoko's thing with Mikan, right? Hiyoko isn't just trying to pick on someone weak she feels dominant over or something, and even if she was, that would be indicative usually of insecurity and other mental problems that bullies in real life suffer from that make them prone to these destructive attitudes. But no, Hiyoko really fucking hates Mikan. You know, she doesn't see Mikan as a victim. Hiyoko lashes out at Mikan because Mikan makes her angry. She dislikes her personality. This is confirmed a number of times. Hiyoko is actually more accurate than the rest of the cast at analyzing Mikan, who only see her as pitiable. Hiyoko knows that Mikan is faking being clumsy to get attention. She knows that Hiyoko is attention-seeking and constantly putting herself in situations to be mocked and ridiculed, etc. Hiyoko finds this incredibly annoying and finds Mikan's disingenuous and cloying attitude really hateable. And when something makes her angry, she lacks the self-control to avoid lashing out at it. I just sympathize with bad attitudes, okay? It's not the same as like an evil decision to me. These kinds of behaviors stem from something much deeper than them just being a shitty person. They're almost always a victim suffering from something, and it's impulsive behavior. And it's not even necessarily poor judgment, it's just a surface-level grittiness, you know, a surface-level abrasiveness. The worst thing that Hiyoko does to others is mildly annoy them or insult them, but her strong negative emotions end up hurting her a lot. Way more than her negative emotions end up hurting anyone else. They isolate her from everyone. In Chapter 3, after Nekomaru gets injured, we see Hiyoko's emotions coming out, her negative feelings and her built-in bad attitudes flaring up, making her feel like she was stupid to try to work along with the others, making her feel like she's just going to end up dead too, and she cuts herself off and then dies shortly after that, you know? Just self-isolating, self-destructive behavior, just kind of pitiable. But mainly, I just like the mental image of Survivor Hiyoko and her dynamic with the group endgame replacing Fuyuhiko. It's cute, and she'd probably be funnier than Fuyuhiko, too. I'm not sure what else to say, so I'll play you out with this dronable clip talking about Audrey Belrose.
So now that we know who Audrey is, what her lifestyle's like, and what her desires are, what exactly is it that makes me love Audrey? Well, I said it in the beginning of the video, I empathize with Audrey. I can empathize with a person who has high self-confidence but doubts theirself in places. I can empathize with a person who spends their days feeling like something's missing from their life and they just don't know what. I can empathize with a person who's been taken advantage of before. I can empathize with a person who believes in being yourself and gets a bad reputation because of who they are. I can empathize with a person who just needs a little love.
Anyways, that's all for me today. See ya.